There are moments in history when beauty becomes destiny, when a single face can stop time. And yet, behind that perfection lies a storm no one dares to name. Grace Kelly was that kind of silence, elegant, fragile, untouchable, a woman who seemed carved from moonlight itself. But moonlight, as we know, cannot survive the dawn. Before she was a princess, she was Hollywood's golden flame, the woman who stood beside Hitchcock's camera and turned fear into poetry, restraint into desire. Every frame of her face seemed to whisper something forbidden, that she did not belong to any world, not to cinema, not to the palace, not even to herself. People saw the fairy tale, they saw the veil, the diamonds, the royal balcony. But no one saw the loneliness hidden behind her crown, the ache of a woman who traded her art for duty, her soul for silence. Behind that immaculate composure, there was a restless heart, one that never stopped hearing the applause of a world she had been forced to leave behind. When the crash came on that September morning in 1982, the news spread like a shattering mirror. The world mourned a princess, but Hollywood mourned a ghost that had never truly left its stage. Because Grace Kelly was not born to be a monarch, she was born to be a moment that burned too brightly, too briefly, and left the world chasing its reflection ever since. Before there was Grace Kelly, the Princess of Monaco, there was Grace Patricia Kelly, a shy, fair-haired girl born on a cold November morning in 1,929 inches, Philadelphia. Her father, John Brendan Kelly Sr., was a self-made millionaire and three-time Olympic gold medalist in rowing, a man of thunderous pride and relentless discipline. Her mother, Margaret Major, was a former model and the first female coach at the University of Pennsylvania, elegant, poised, and ambitious. In the Kelly household, achievement was the family language, and tenderness was often replaced by expectation. Grace was different. She was quiet, where her siblings were loud, dreamy, where they were determined. While her father saw her as fragile, "My beautiful but not very strong daughter," he once said, Grace built her own fortress in silence. She read poetry by candlelight, recited plays to herself in front of the mirror, and found refuge in the soft rhythm of imagination. It was her way of surviving a world ruled by performance and medals. At the age of 12, she was already writing letters to herself, little notes that said things like, "You can be more than they think." She kept those notes hidden under her pillow, as if afraid someone would discover her secret hunger, not for fame, but for freedom. When she performed in school plays, her teachers noticed something uncanny. She didn't act, she became. Even then, her voice had that quiet gravity, her gaze that strange melancholy, which later would captivate millions. After high school, when she told her family she wanted to study acting, her father laughed. He wanted his daughter to marry well, not to chase illusions. "Acting is a slime chance," he said, "and you're not made for struggle." But Grace, polite, delicate, yet unwavering, had inherited something from Chaim after all, the will to win. She applied to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York, and when the acceptance letter arrived, she left Philadelphia behind, like a bird escaping its cage. The city swallowed her whole. Grace rented a small room at the Barbizon Hotel for women, sharing bathrooms with strangers, and eating soup for days when she couldn't afford anything else. She modeled gloves and hats to pay for tuition, standing for hours in cold studios while photographers adjusted lights around her porcelain face. They said she looked like a dream, but the truth was, she was fighting to stay awake in one. During those years, she learned two things that would define her life: that beauty was a weapon, and that silence could be armor. She practiced both to perfection. Directors saw in her what her father never did, a rare stillness that spoke louder than words. Soon Broadway came calling, and television followed. In front of the camera, Grace found what she had been searching for all along: a language that didn't require her to raise her voice. Every movement, every breath, every pause became a confession. She could express the pain she had never been allowed to show, but behind that serene rise to fame, the little girl from Philadelphia still lingered, the one who used to hide her letters under the pillow, waiting for someone to tell her she was enough. That need, that wound, would follow her through Hollywood's brightest lights and eventually into the cold marble corridors of a palace she never truly called home. New York was where Grace learned to survive. Hollywood was where she learned to disappear. Her breakthrough came quietly, almost by accident. In 1951, a young Grace Kelly caught the attention of a casting director during a television play called the Philco Television Playhouse. Her calm presence, her understated beauty, they made people stop talking. She didn't need to shout. She simply existed, and the room shifted. That same year, she was offered a small role in 14 Hours. She barely spoke a dozen lines, yet critics remembered her. It wasn't what she said, it was the way she listened. Then came 1952, and fate arrived wearing a tuxedo, Gary Cooper. He was filming High Noon, and Grace, just 22, played his young wife. The chemistry was quiet, almost fragile, but it burned beneath the surface. The film was a success, and overnight, she became the face of a new kind of femininity, dignified, distant, and devastatingly alluring. Hollywood at the TMA was loud. Marilyn Monroe was breathing fire. Elizabeth Taylor was all diamonds and scandal, but Grace was ice. Hitchcock saw it immediately. When he first met her, he called her the paradox of fire and snow. To him, she was the perfect canvas, the woman who could smolder without moving, who could scream with her eyes. Their collaboration defined her legend. Dial M for Murder, Rear Window, To Catch a Thief. Each film was a study in elegance and repression, in danger hidden behind poise. She was never the damsel, she was the secret, the one men wanted to save but could never truly possess. And beneath those roles, something deeply personal was happening. Grace was discovering how to turn her fragility into control. Off-screen, she was more complex than her polished image suggested. There were rumors about Clark Gable, about William Holden, even about Hitchcock himself, whose obsession with her became unsettling. She moved through those rumors with grace, the word that was both her name and her defense. Yet privately, she was still the girl from Philadelphia, writing letters home, yearning for normalcy. Then came The Country Girl in 1954, the role that stripped away glamour and left only raw humanity. She played the weary wife of a broken singer, and for the first time, audiences saw her bleed. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress. The applause that night echoed through her bones, but instead of triumph, she felt something unexpected: emptiness. She was at the top, but already, she was looking for a way out. Hollywood adored her, but she distrusted its love. It demanded too much: her image, her privacy, her soul. When she was invited to the Cannes Film Festival in 1955, she accepted, not knowing it would change everything. A photo shoot was arranged at the Palace of Monaco, and there she met Prince Rainier III. The moment was awkward, she was radiant, he was reserved, yet something in that encounter lingered. Letters followed, and soon the fairy tale began to write itself. The world saw romance. Grace saw refuge. She was tired of pretending to be perfect on film. Perhaps being a princess would allow her to be someone else entirely. But she would learn that palaces have cameras too, only quieter, colder ones. By the end of 1956, she had married the prince and retired from acting forever. Hollywood wept. Hitchcock was furious. "I lost my favorite leading lady to a monarchy," he said. Grace smiled politely, as she always did, but in her eyes, there was a shadow. The kind that follows you when you walk away from the light. She had traded scripts for ceremonies, applause for protocol, and dreams for duty. The girl who once whispered, "You can be more than they think," had become everything the world could imagine except herself. The fairy tale began with trumpets, but it was built on silence. On the 19th of April 1956, the streets of Monaco overflowed with roses, flags, and feverish applause. The world watched as Grace Kelly, draped in ivory lace and pearls, walked down the aisle toward Prince Rainier III. It was called the Wedding of the Century. Her gown, created by MGM's costume department, shimmered like snow beneath cathedral light. The cameras adored her one last TMA, and as she said, "I do," an entire generation sighed as if Hollywood itself were losing a daughter to destiny. But behind that breathtaking ceremony, Grace felt something cold unfurling in her chest. The applause faded, the castle doors closed, and suddenly she was surrounded, not by directors and scripts, but by protocol and expectations. The princess was to wake early, attend audiences, smile without faltering, and never ever break character. Her life had become a permanent performance, one with no curtain to fall. At first, she tried to embrace it. She studied languages, learned etiquette, met ambassadors, and mothered 2 children, Caroline and Albert. Photographs from those years show her radiant, elegant, the embodiment of grace itself. Yet friends noticed the cracks. The sparkle in her eyes dimmed. She began to retreat into the private chambers of the palace, where her laughter no longer echoed. Letters to her old friends in Hollywood spoke of a quiet kind of loneliness and a longing that feels like hunger. Hitchcock reached out to her in 1962, offering her a chance to return to the screen in Marnie. For a moment, her heart leapt. She read the script in secret, whispering lines in the mirror, like she once had as a girl in Philadelphia. But the people of Monaco revolted at the idea of their princess, portraying a thief and a woman broken by trauma. It was unthinkable. Under public pressure, Grace withdrew from the project. Hitchcock never forgave the world for stealing her twice. The walls of the palace grew tighter. She filled her team with charity work, poetry, and gardens. The gardens became her refuge, rows of white lilies, delicate and untouchable, just like her. So many times she would walk there alone at dawn, barefoot, dew on her hem, whispering lines from plays she would never perform again. In those moments, she wasn't a princess. She was Grace, the woman who once dreamed of being seen, now longing only to be remembered. Her marriage, too, was no longer the picture in the magazines. Rainier was stern, proud, and bound to the traditions of his throne. Grace's emotional world, delicate, artistic, yearning, rarely found space in his logic. There were long dinners in silence, glances that said nothing, and a loneliness that grew like ivy around her heart. Rumors began to swirl again, about fleeting friendships with artists and writers, about nights spent wandering the palace gardens long after everyone else was asleep. Still, she remained dignified. Her composure became her armor. The press adored her restraint, calling her the perfect princess. But those closest to her saw a different truth. She had mastered the art of appearing calm while drowning beneath the surface. She missed acting the way one misses air. At times, she confessed to friends that she dreamed of returning not for fame, but to feel alive again. When she visited the United States, Hollywood would rise in her honor, yet she always seemed distant, as if she were looking at her past through glass. Once, a journalist asked her if she ever regretted leaving the movies. She paused, smiled faintly, and said, "Sometimes fairy tales demand a price." By the mid-1970s, Grace had become an icon, a living relic of glamour in a world that had moved on. The new stars were louder, freer, unrestrained. She admired them, perhaps even envied them. They could say what they wanted, live as they pleased. She, meanwhile, was trapped in a story that had been written for her long ago, a princess who could no longer rewrite her own ending. Yet, in her quiet rebellion, she began nurturing the arts in Monaco, creating a foundation for young artists, photographers, and dancers. It was her way of keeping the flame alive. If she could no longer perform, she would help others do so. She poured her soul into their dreams, silently giving them the freedom she had lost. But freedom, once tasted, never stops whispering. Sometimes, when she drove alone along the narrow mountain roads of the Riviera, the sea wind in her hair, she felt a fleeting illusion of it. Again, that girl from Philadelphia, free, unguarded, alive. And perhaps, deep down, she knew that such roads, beautiful and dangerous, would one day carry her toward her final act. By the early 1982, the fairy tale had begun to fray at its edges. The castle still stood, but its walls no longer glittered with wonder. Grace Kelly was 52 years old, but her eyes carried the fatigue of someone twice that age. Her children were grown, her marriage formal, her fame fading into legend. The world still called her Princess Grace, but in her private journals she began signing her name simply Grace K, as if reclaiming the part of herself she had lost somewhere between Hollywood and Monaco. Those who saw her in those final years spoke of her quiet melancholy. She smiled, yes, the same luminous, practiced smile that once lit up cinema screens, but it no longer reached her eyes. There were whispers of insomnia, of headaches, of stress that no crown could conceal. She spoke often of returning to film, perhaps directing or writing. "I want to create again," she told a friend. Not to be looked at, but to look. She had started sketching outlines for a small film about aging, love, and identity. A mirror of her own life. It would never be made. The summer of 1982 was warm and deceptive, blue skies that hid thunder beneath. Grace was preparing her daughter Stephanie for a move to Paris. On the morning of September 13, she insisted on driving herself down the winding roads of the Côte d'Azur. It was a route she had taken countless times before, narrow, steep, lined with cliffs and Mediterranean light. That morning, witnesses said, the princess seemed distracted, her face pale, her voice distant. Some say she was arguing softly with Stephanie. Others recall her humming absent-mindedly, lost in thought. At 9:40 a.m., the car failed to make a curve near Cap d'Aile. It plunged down a 40-foot slope, rolling into an olive grove. The crash was sudden, brutal, and silent. The kind of ending no script could have softened. Stephanie survived with minor injuries, but Grace was found unconscious, her body broken, her pulse faint. The hospital in Monaco did everything they could, but the damage was irreversible. A cerebral hemorrhage had struck before the crash, perhaps while she was driving, leaving her with no chance to recover. When the news broke, the world froze. Monaco went into mourning. Hollywood wept, as though a star had fallen from the sky itself. She was declared dead the following evening, at 10:55 p.m., surrounded by her husband, her children, and the quiet hum of machines. Outside, the Mediterranean waves lapped against the rocks, indifferent and eternal. Her funeral on September 18 drew the eyes of the world once more. Cary Grant wept openly. Princess Diana, just 21, stood among the mourners, another woman, soon to learn that fairy tales can be cages. Hitchcock, already old and ill, refused to speak to reporters. He simply said, "She was pure cinema." And then, as if closing a reel, he walked away. The images of that day still haunt anyone who remembers them. The marble cathedral, the sea of white flowers, the lonely widower with gray hair and trembling hands. The orchestra played softly as the casket, draped in lilies, was carried through the crowd. Somewhere in that silence, one could almost hear the echo of applause, faint, distant, eternal. After her death, rumors bloomed like ghosts. Some claimed the crash was not an accident. Others whispered of depression, of medication, of secrets buried deep in palace corridors. The official report said her stroke had caused the accident, but mystery clung to her story like perfume. Grace Kelly had been a symbol for so long that even her death became a myth. One more performance she never intended to give. In the months that followed, the palace turned into a mausoleum of memories. Rainier was never the same. His face hardened, his heart hollowed. He kept her dresses in their closets, her photographs on every wall. He rarely spoke of her, except to say, "She brought light into a kingdom that did not deserve her." But perhaps the most haunting truth lay in the simplicity of her end. After decades of living in carefully choreographed perfection, Grace Kelly died in the one moment she was truly herself, behind the wheel, free, unguarded, moving fast along the open road. In that fleeting instant before the crash, she might have felt the wind again, the taste of salt on her lips, the echo of applause in her chest. For the first time in years, she wasn't a princess, or an icon, or a myth. She was simply Grace, a woman chasing her own horizon. In death, she became everything she had always been denied in life: timeless, untouchable, eternal. The cameras had stopped rolling long ago, yet the world never stopped watching. And perhaps that's the final tragedy, that the woman who longed for silence was immortalized in noise. After Grace's death, time in Monaco seemed to slow, as though the entire principality was caught between disbelief and denial. The palace that once glowed with her presence now stood like a monument of absence. The corridors she used to walk became silent. The gardens she had nurtured grew wild and untended. Prince Rainier retreated behind heavy doors, refusing most visitors. The country mourned not just a princess, but a myth it had built around her. The world had called her Her Serene Highness. In truth, serenity was the one thing she had never truly possessed. Her death shook Hollywood in a way few others could. For actors and filmmakers, she represented something that no longer existed, a form of beauty that was pure but unreachable, the embodiment of a lost age. In Los Angeles, theaters rescreened her films for weeks. Lines formed outside the Egyptian Theater, where Rear Window played in her memory. Young actresses left white roses on the Walk of Fame star that bore her name. And for many who had known her, grief came with a sense of guilt. They had celebrated her escape into royalty, never realizing that it might have been her undoing. But Grace's story didn't end with her death. It transformed. Her children, Caroline, Albert, and Stephanie, grew up under the heavy weight of her absence. For them, she became both memory and prophecy, a reminder of what it meant to live under the relentless gaze of the world. Caroline carried her elegance, Albert her duty, and Stephanie her rebellion. They were fragments of their mother's soul, scattered between grace and resistance. For Prince Rainier, grief became devotion. He turned their shared home into a shrine, preserving her possessions exactly as she had left them. Her favorite perfume, Guerlain's Le Heur Bleu, was still kept on her dressing table, the bottle never opened again. He would walk into her room late at night, sit by the window, and stare at the same horizon she used to watch. In those quiet hours, it was said he spoke to her not as a ruler to a ghost, but as a man to the only person who had ever understood him. He lived 23 more years after her passing, but his life became an echo of hers, fading slowly until he was finally buried beside her in 2005. Outside the palace walls, the legend of Grace Kelly grew stronger with every year. Books, documentaries, even conspiracy theories tried to define who she truly was: saint, prisoner, muse, or martyr. The truth, as always, was somewhere between. Her face became a timeless image, reprinted endlessly. The perfect symmetry, the poised neck, the eyes that seemed to hold both ice and fire. Yet few remembered the woman behind them, the dreamer, who once wrote letters to herself, reminding her to believe in something more. Grace's influence extended beyond the screen or the crown. In Monaco, she had founded the Princess Grace Foundation to support young artists. After her death, the foundation expanded globally, funding dancers, actors, and filmmakers, many of whom later said that her story gave them courage to pursue their art. In a quiet way, she continued to do what she had always wanted, to help others create, to breathe life into stories that might have otherwise gone unheard. In Hollywood, directors continued to study her films, fascinated by her restraint. Alfred Hitchcock's protégés spoke of her as the ghost that haunts the frame. Martin Scorsese once said that Grace Kelly understood silence the way musicians understand rhythm. Modern actresses, from Nicole Kidman to Kate Blanchett, cited her as an influence, though none could truly replicate her alchemy of fragility and steel. As the decades passed, nostalgia turned her into something even more mythic, a bridge between the golden age of cinema and the age of celebrity. In an era when stars exposed everything, Grace Kelly became the icon of mystery, a symbol of what the world had lost: discretion, dignity, and depth. Her legend endured not because she lived loudly, but because she vanished beautifully. Yet, beneath all the marble and memory, the unfinished part of her story still lingers. In her diaries, later published with her family's approval, there were fragments of an unwritten screenplay notes about a woman who returns to her past only to find it waiting for her. It was full of longing, regret, and redemption. The last line she ever wrote in it was "Simplo." There is always one road that leads home. Some believe she meant it literally, a memory of the winding path through the Riviera Hills. Others believe it was spiritual, her way of saying that no matter how far she had gone, the girl from Philadelphia was still waiting inside her. And maybe that's where Grace Kelly truly lives. Not in the palace, not in the films, not even in the headlines of her tragic end. She lives in that idea of return, of a woman who spent her life moving between worlds, never belonging fully to either, yet leaving both changed forever. Time, it seems, has not dimmed the glow of Grace Kelly. Decades after her death, she remains one of those rare figures who exist beyond chronology. Not a woman of the past, but a presence that lingers in the collective memory, shimmering like an old film reel rediscovered in perfect light. Every generation rediscovers her, as if she had never really left. Her story continues to haunt the intersection of art and destiny, the way beauty can both bless and betray, the way fame can elevate and erase. Grace Kelly's life was a contradiction in motion, a woman who had everything, yet always felt she had traded something sacred for it. The truth is that her real performance was never on the screen. It was the life she lived afterward, performing serenity while her soul longed for the chaos of creation. In Monaco, her image is everywhere. The streets bear her name, her statue stands in the gardens she once tended, her face decorates stamps and postcards. Tourists wander through the cathedral where she rests, leaving behind flowers and whispers. But even amid that devotion, there is a sense of distance, because no monument, no matter how beautiful, can capture what she truly was. A paradox wrapped in grace, a woman of light who lived surrounded by shadow. For Hollywood, she remains a touchstone, a reminder of an era when subtlety was strength and silence could seduce. Directors still study her work with Hitchcock, as if deciphering scripture, her stillness in Rear Window, the trembling restraint in To Catch a Thief, the hidden desperation beneath her calm exterior. She proved that power didn't need volume. She made the camera her confidant, not her captor. And in doing so, she changed the grammar of cinema itself. Yet, the most striking thing about her legacy is its emotional resonance. When people remember Grace Kelly, they don't simply recall an actress or a princess. They recall a feeling, the quiet ache of beauty that knows it will fade. the loneliness of someone admired by all but understood by none, the yearning of a heart that outgrew the world that adored it. Her life became a mirror for our own contradictions, our hunger for perfection, our fear of losing it, our desire to be seen, and our exhaustion from being watched. Writers have long debated what she wanted in her final years. Some say she longed for escape, others that she had finally found peace. Perhaps both were true. Maybe her death, sudden, tragic, unresolved, was, in its cruel way, a final act of liberation. On that winding mountain road, she returned to motion, to the rhythm of the wind, to the space between performance and truth. Maybe, for a brief, merciful second before the crash, she felt something like freedom. In the decades that followed, the world tried to retell her story. Biographers, journalists, filmmakers, each attempting to claim her. But Grace Kelly resists definition. Her mystery survives because it was never manufactured. It was who she was. She lived her life as if behind glass, revealing just enough to be remembered, concealing just enough to remain eternal. Her daughter Princess Caroline once said, "My mother never belonged to us. She belonged to the world. But the world, in truth, never truly possessed her either. It could only circle her light, mesmerized, unable to touch the flame. Even today, when audiences watch her glide across the screen, that poise, that soft defiance, there's a strange familiarity. She feels both near and unreachable, like someone you've met in a dream. And maybe that's the secret of her immortality. She exists in the realm between memory and myth, between what was real and what we needed to believe. In one of her last interviews, she was asked if she ever missed acting. She paused, smiled, the way only she could, that faint curve of the lips, eyes lowered, a hint of irony, and said, "Acting is part of me. Perhaps it's what allows me to endure everything else." It was a confession wrapped in elegance, the kind that reveals more in what it hides. Endurance, that was her true art. Grace Kelly endured the weight of perfection, the exile of fame, the coldness of privilege, and the loneliness of admiration. She bore it with a composure that would have broken most. And in the end, that composure became her rebellion. She turned fragility into strength, silence into voice, disappearance into presence. When the lights of Monaco fade each evening, her resting place in St. Nicholas Cathedral remains softly illuminated. Locals say that on clear nights, when the sea breeze moves through the old stone, it carries the faint scent of lilies, her favorite flower. Some claim it's superstition, others call it remembrance. But for those who believe in such quiet miracles, it feels like her spirit graceful, enduring, at peace. Grace Kelly's life was never about crowns or cameras. It was about the impossible pursuit of wholeness, the attempt to reconcile duty and desire, art and identity, the public dream and the private self. That's what makes her story universal. It's not just the tale of a woman who became a princess. It's the story of anyone who has ever stood between two worlds, longing for one while trapped in the other. Perhaps that's why, even now, her name feels like a whisper, not shouted, but breathed. Grace. The word itself is both prayer and promise. And maybe that is her final gift. The reminder that grace is not perfection, but persistence. The quiet courage to stay beautiful, even while breaking. Because in the end, she was never simply a princess, or an actress, or an icon. She was a question eternal, luminous, unanswered, about what it means to live a life that the world keeps rewriting.